So, welcome to Lexikopoleio, the International Bookstore of Athens. It is a great privilege for us to present this marvelous book, and of course, the discussion will be extended beyond this book. Slaves, Wives and Brides, Women Under the Rule of ISIS. I cannot pronounce correctly the name of Judit Neurink, but I did my best, as you can see. Please switch off your mobile phones, if you can. And coordinating an introduction will be made by our good friend Niki Boehm, interpreter. Was it good? Well, 50-50. That was enough. So a great big applause for the two ladies, and we begin. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Can you hear me well? Is that okay for everyone in the background as well? Okay, cool. So I'm Niki Boehm, and with us is Judit Neurink. I hope I pronounced it correctly. She, for those of you who don't already know her, she is a Dutch author and journalist. She has been working as a journalist for many years and as an author as well. She has been living for about 10 years. She lived for 10 years in Iraq, in Iraqi Kurdistan, to be precise. And she's an expert on all things Middle East, not just Iraq, and all things ISIS as well, as she will soon tell us. And while she lived in Iraqi Kurdistan, she established a media center, a training center for journalists that she ran for about 5 or 6 years.
5 years.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes. And she also works for print media, online and offline. Deutsche Welle, for example, and the New Arab are two of them. And she has written quite a few books. The one that we will primarily be discussing today is Slaves, Wives and Brides, Women Under the Rule of ISIS. But she's also written fiction books as well. The Jewish Bride is one of them, I believe.
Yeah, The Jewish Bride is also available here. It's a book about Jews in Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
And I made it a novel because I want a lot of people to read about this hidden past of Iraq, because it's lost.
Mm-hmm. So when Odile kindly asked me to moderate this discussion, I jumped on the chance because I think that it's very important for all of us here in Greece, considering the refugee and migrant situation right now, to hear specific stories from the individuals who come here. And I'm pretty sure that some of the women that you have talked to have ended up here in Greece. And I think in general, for all of us, in order to understand the situation better and to understand where all of these people are coming from, literally and metaphorically, it's good to know their stories, and especially women's stories, which are not as often heard and told, I think. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons why I wrote the book, because you hear about the men, but you hardly hear about the women, and they play big roles too.
Mm-hmm. And so when did you decide to write this particular book, and how did you approach the research? How did you find the women? Was it easy to talk to them? Were they reluctant to talk to you? What was the process that you used?
That's a lot of questions in
Yes.
one. Niki.
I know.
Okay, let me try. Good evening to all of you. Very nice to see you. The reason why I wrote this book is really because I found there are so many stories out there that we do not hear in the West, and mainly the stories about women. I looked at the victims mostly, but also at the perpetrators, and the perpetrators were much more difficult to find than the victims. Research meant really that I had to go and speak to people. Victims were mainly the women that were kidnapped. We will talk about that in detail, I think. And eventually they were released or they were bought free. And if I could, I would go and talk to them. And during the years that ISIS was very much part of my life, I guess I must have spoken to at least 50. I have stopped counting, to be quite honest, because it was, the conversations as such were difficult. People, of course, had to talk about something that touched on their shame, on their honor. The things that ISIS was doing were the most terrible that I have found in my career. And I've done a lot of stories. I've talked to a lot of people, but ISIS really was topping it all. It was the most cruel and gruesome organization, and still is actually, because it's still out there.
In your book, sorry. In your book, you do mention explicitly why they wish to have slaves and why they use this practice. You explain the religious reasons as well. Would you like to say a few words on that? That way, also describing a bit of the philosophy of ISIS, if we can call it a philosophy, of course.
Well, ISIS is by origin a Salafist movement. But the problem is that it turned Islam sort of upside down. There's a lot of elements that they have taken from the Quran. I tend to call it's a cut and paste Islam, what they have. They use only those things from the Quran that they find useful. And most of them are the negative things. There's a lot of positive and peaceful things in the Quran as well. ISIS is not using them. That means that when you look at the base, the Salafi base, it's very important to have a caliphate, the state for all Muslims. ISIS was it was the only Salafi organization that really said, we're going to do this, we're going to start with the state, because if you look at how it should go according to their beliefs, it should be at the end. They said, let's have the state first, and then the rest will come. Part of that state, part of this whole belief is that they should go back to the time of the Prophet, the first time when the Prophet had his first followers and then his first caliphs. Those rules that applied at that time, ISIS wanted to put back in place. And part of those rules is that if you have a battle, the people that you capture in that battle, they're yours. You can do with them what you want, especially when they are, as ISIS sees them, unbelievers. Now, unbelievers is a very broad thing. There's people that have another faith, like the Yazidis, which have a completely different faith, but still believe in one God. You have Christians and Jews, who are people of the book according to the Quran, so there is different rules for them. But if we talk for the moment about the group that I mainly touch on in the book, the Yazidis, they were considered as unbelievers, and for that reason, ISIS was allowing itself to take the women as slaves and kill the men. Children were used, heavily brainwashed, and used as fighters. And many of them died. Let me give you some figures. Of the Yazidis that were captured, there were about 6,400 that were captured. Around 3,000, a little bit less, are still missing. So this hasn't ended yet. There still is a whole tragedy out there.
So, as you just said, they primarily targeted the Yazidi people and the Yazidi women. Were the women that you talked to mostly Yazidi as well, or have you spoken to other people, other women from other unbelieving groups?
No, I spoke to the Yazidis.
Mostly Yazidis.
In the beginning, there was talk that the Christians were also victim, and I have thought that for a long time, until at the end we found that really no one was missing, and everybody that had been missing was found. So the people that were targeted, that were the Yazidis. At the same time, not unbelievers, Shiite people were targeted. So make it simple, Islam has really two main branches, Sunni, Shiite. ISIS is Sunni. Shiite are people, for instance, in Iran, but also at the moment the Shiite are the majority in Iraq, and in the south and in Baghdad there are mostly Shiite living. In Mosul and around Mosul there were also Shiite minorities living. Those people were also targeted, and it took a long time because of the shame and the honor thing that we found out that hundreds of Shiite women were also enslaved.
Yeah. I was just I wanted to lead exactly to that. You mentioned in your book how most of the women that you spoke to were very much afraid of the stigma of having been violated, and were in fact, on the one hand, wanting to talk to you, but also wanting to conceal the fact that they had been basically raped by ISIS members, and they like to use the phrase "forced to marry." I believe you write in your book.
Yes, I went to talk to Yazidi girls. Now, ISIS thinks that girls from 9 onwards are fit for sex. That means that a lot of young women have been taken and raped, and some of them have been released or have been bought free. The ones that I talked to usually in the beginning escaped. Later on, their families bought them for a lot of money. But those first girls, there was a lot of shame. I spoke, for instance, to a girl that I call in my book Smile, because she was the whole time smiling. It only later on I understood why she was doing that. She had been she was so scared of everything that she was trying to ward off this scary world with smiling to everybody. She told me how she was kidnapped and what happened to her. And I will read a little from the book about that. It starts with her quote. "He took me, along with another girl, to the house of his sister in Mosul," Smile said. "He forced me to marry him. It took me a few interviews before I understood that there was no actual marriage ceremony in the presence of an imam, in which the woman became the wife of a fighter or an emir, as those in supervisory positions were called. It became clear that for the women it was impossible to openly say that they had been raped. The term forced to marry stood for forced to have sex. Because they viewed the women as the spoils of war and slaves, ISIS fighters believed that they had the right to have sex with them without having to be married. The bill of sale was enough, because that proved they owned them, though it has become clear that some of the most strict religious followers did in fact still enter into a temporary marriage."
In your book, you also mentioned the role of the wives of the ISIS members and how oftentimes they were accomplices in punishing the young girls or the women that were enslaved. Would you like to say a few more things about that?
This was a main problem that the girls were talking about. It was not only the fact that when they were sold, the first thing that happened was that the men wanted sex with them. Often, it was the women who prepared them for it. Especially in the beginning, the stories were of young girls, virgins, who were taken to ISIS fighters, to the emirs, and then there were women making sure that they had makeup, that they were putting nice clothes on. So that happened because the women were thinking that what they were doing was what was right, what God was allowing, what the Quran said was correct. And women were, especially the women that were before becoming Muslim, they had been Christian, or those that converted into Islam, the foreign women, they were the worst. They were the most radical. They were actually writing into the magazine that ISIS was publishing why it was so good to have these slaves in the Caliphate, and that this was what God wanted. And when you read that, you really think, can women really believe this? How can they do this to each other? Is there no solidarity between women? And my conclusion was, when I talked to these girls, that they had not found it. The only solidarity that was there was between the victims, between the ISIS girls, the Yazidi girls. And I found one girl who told me about a friendship that she started with a second wife of her owner, because the second wife didn't want all this to happen and took her side. But that hardly happened. That was really very exceptional.
So you've brought with you another edition of your book, the Dutch edition, in fact, and I would like to show it to the audience because it is vastly different from the English one. And I would like you to tell us why and what we're seeing in this cover and why it's not on the English cover, for example.
This cover, and the title is The Women of the Caliphate. This cover shows, it's a scene from what happened in Mosul where Yazidi women were actually sold. There were markets, and I know this from people who lived through the occupation of ISIS in Mosul. There were markets where the women were sold. This was made by a Yazidi painter who made, I think, 10 paintings with all the things that happened to his people during the time of ISIS. He went to Europe and he had an exhibition with it, and I met him, and I saw this and I thought, this is the cover of the book. In Holland, this went well. The Dutch were not shocked by the cover. But I found that for the American audience, this was too, what shall I say? Too radical, that's a good word. I mean, it too direct, perhaps, yeah. So that's why when I because I made this cover, this is an Amazon version. I took a picture that one of the photographers I work with a lot, Eddie van Wessel, he made this, and if you open the book you can see it. He made this in Tal Afar, which was a place where Yazidi girls were put in houses and in cinemas and in big places on the way to be taken to Syria, Mosul, wherever. And he found this old cinema where there were beds, and actually no mattresses on them, so just the bare beds, and there were a lot of clothes on them. And he thought at that moment that they had to be Yazidi clothes. Now, in hindsight, I know that these must have been the clothes of the Shiite women and children that were also kidnapped and that we didn't know about at that moment, because that was in Tal Afar. I have tried to find out exactly what happened in that cinema, and that's still a story I would like to make, but I can't find it because I can't find people who will tell me.
I was just going to ask you what the situation is today regarding everything you've just been telling us.
Well, I've been to Mosul, and I have spoken to a lot of people there who survived the occupation. The occupation was terrible. I mean, all the women had to dress in niqab. They were not allowed to go out on their own, only with either a husband or another family member, a direct blood relation. Even if they had no gloves on, or I heard of someone who had a hole in a sock and that was showing, they were picked up by a special morality police. And actually, the women of ISIS were active in this morality police. There was a special female branch of that, the Ghansat Brigade. And they picked up these women and then punished them. In the beginning, that was lashes, but after a while, it became more cruel because women were also trying to stand up against the occupation. So the reaction was cruelty, and the women that were punishing those local women were even using something that is called the biter. It's a metal thing that they would use on parts of their body, really inflicting wounds that had to be stitched, and horrible, yeah.
So this is where the Madeleine Albright quote would apply that you mentioned in your book, that there's a special place in hell for women who don't help other women, I guess.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
Have you kept in touch with any of the women you interviewed for the book?
No, because they all sort of moved around. What happened to the Yazidi women, and I have spoken to them over the course of about 3 years, I guess. The first women, they were actually quite lucky because they were able to go, over 1,000 of them have been taken in by Germany. Germany had this program for 1,000 women, but those that came after them were actually much more traumatized. For them, only years later, programs started. Now France is doing something for them. Australia is doing something for them. And in Iraq itself, there is therapy, there is special institutes that are helping them. This was another problem. Although Iraq has had traumatized people for years because there have been wars after wars after wars, there is hardly any real therapists. There's psychiatrists who will give you a pill. That's not what you want when you have been through all this, what the women who have been with ISIS
have PTSD.
They have PTSD. They are badly traumatized. So one of the organizations in Iraq set up in one of the universities a special course for therapists to help these traumatized Yazidi women. But of course there are, if you know that about 3,000 of them have come back, and some of them are children, you cannot get enough therapists for that. So there still is a lot of these women in the IDP camps that are in Iraq, and they cannot go back to their own province because it's still not safe there. They're really in limbo at the moment.
There's also another issue. A lot of these women who were enslaved by ISIS and were violated, they bore children, known as ISIS babies, and their situation seems to be precarious as well because they seem to be unwanted by the society. Can you tell us a bit more on that?
This is one of the problems that remains and one of the problems that needs solving, but the only ones that can solve it is the Yazidi community itself. Now, the Yazidi community, let me tell you a little bit about it. It's a very old faith, connected to the Zoroaster, Zarathustra, if that rings a bell. They have a very strict rule that you can only marry inside the community. They're trying to keep the community pure, clean, yeah. So women who came back after being raped, strictly speaking, would not have been allowed back into the community. Now, the religious leader of the Yazidis, the Baba Sheikh, who I met a number of times, a very nice old gentleman, he decided that the women that were coming back had to be taken back into the community. They made a special purification ceremony for them at their temple. And so the women are taken back. Of course, there's always problems. There's always people that still think honor is an important issue. But in general, this has gone okay. But with the children, there's another problem. They are children of Muslim fathers. They are children of the rapists. They are children of the group that did all this to the Yazidis. So they are not acceptable. There's no way, even though the Baba Sheikh tried, he tried to say, let's accept the children, let's do that. The community did not agree, because a child that has an unknown father in Iraq is supposed to be Muslim. He's going to get the Muslim sticker on his ID. So inside the Yazidi community, they do not want the Muslim children. Now, the women who came back, they had a terrible dilemma. Were they going to come back? Well, the first ones didn't know that this was going to happen. So they came back, and then the children were put in orphanages. They still are. Some women heard about this while still inside the Caliphate, and Their families were trying to buy them and tell them to bring their children. Some women decided that they would not bring their children because they could not think of putting them in an orphanage. It would be better to leave them behind. And a lot more women actually decided not to come at all. And that is a problem that the community at the moment has, because they still want the rest of those women to come back. Some of them are still with ISIS, still with the ISIS families, and we know that they are. Some of them are with families in Iraq and in Syria. Some have been taken to Saudi Arabia, some have been taken to Jordan. Women will not come back if they cannot bring their children and keep them with them. I spoke to the religious authorities of the Yazidis about it. Not the Baba Sheikh, because he as a private person thinks differently than the authorities. The authorities say, what we can advise these children is go abroad. If you go to France or England or Germany, or well, there is a big Yazidi community in Germany, it will be easier. The children will be accepted easier there. The stigma will not be so big. So if you want to keep your child, you might have to let it go into an orphanage, but as soon as we can organize that you go abroad, you can take your child with you. But for a lot of women, of course, that's not the solution.
So I was thinking, since you're with us and you're an expert on all things Iraq and ISIS, we should perhaps ask you about the current situation in Iraq and what is happening in Baghdad in recent days. Would you like to comment on that and tell us a few things? Because we haven't been reading that much about it in Greek media.
I would like to, but could we park the question for a moment?
Yes, definitely.
Because there's one thing I would really like to tell you about as well. People probably have heard that the mission to kill Baghdadi last month was named after an American lady, Kayla Mueller. Kayla had been kidnapped by another radical group and then sold to ISIS. And in ISIS custody, she became, as I found out, the slave of Baghdadi himself. And I would like to read you a little bit about it. I'd like to tell you how I found it out. When I was interviewing young girls, I found some girls that had been in a house where they had also been in contact with Baghdadi. It appeared that there was a sort of brothel for the leadership. And that was in Syria, and these girls had been able to actually get out, to escape. And their story was incredible, because they could tell us things that we didn't know yet. These girls, two of them escaped, and I spoke to Sosan, one of them, and she told me about her relationship with Kayla and how that all came about. She told me that they asked her again and again to come with them when they were planning an escape, but Kayla refused. She would, as an American, draw too much attention whenever they would have to ask for help of civilians along the way, she gave as the reason, and she would be putting the girls in danger. Along with two others, Suad made an escape attempt, and I should tell you, Suad is a girl that I have looked for years, and finally she escaped as well. So along with two others, Suad made an escape attempt, but they were caught. She received a very severe beating, but was surprisingly enough returned to Sosan and the others afterwards. Other women who escaped were punished much more severely. What was so special about Suad? I only understand this when Sosan tells me who she was married to. To the big boss himself. Suad was the Yazidi slave of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And what about Kayla, I want to know. Is it true that she was the slave of the Tunisian Abu Sayyaf? Abu Sayyaf had this brothel. Sosan can't stop herself laughing about this. No, she was with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the big ISIS leader himself, she too. Sosan says that she had seen him frequently at Abu Sayyaf's place. He was there often. I do not know why, but every time he took Kayla away, and then later on she would come back to us. Abu Sayyaf would pick up Kayla in order to bring her to Baghdadi, who had his own room in that house and stayed there on a regular basis. But when she would return to their room, she would tell the girls each time, often in tears, that he had forced her to marry him, Sosan says. Because of their shared fate, the 5 women had bonded greatly. Now, the story of Kayla I shared with her parents, and I guess we should really, because there is a picture of Kayla here as well. Let's move on. We'll move back in a minute. Yeah, that's Kayla. One more. Yeah. So this is Kayla. Her parents were they were happy to hear, but of course it was a terrible story. They did not know what happened to their daughter. They only had one letter from her saying how sorry she was what happened to her. When they found out that she was actually with Baghdadi, they tried very hard to find out what happened with her afterwards. A couple of months later, she was killed. There was a bombing by the coalition forces, and ISIS says that she was killed in that bombing. We don't know. There is another story that is surfacing as well, and that I also heard from Suad, the girl that I've been looking for, when I spoke to her, but I had trouble believing it. Suad said that there was a matter of jealousy between the wives of Baghdadi and Kayla, and that was one of the reasons why she was given away to another guy. And lately, a story has surfaced that she was actually killed then because of this jealousy and because she had become a security issue for ISIS. If you go to the next picture, I took pictures of all the girls that I talked to for myself. I never published them, but I let you see this one. Sozan is the girl that is standing, now I have to see, in the middle, sort of. The other 2 girls are her sisters. One of them was also kidnapped and also was able to escape. I would talk to them, these girls. I talked to about Kayla, and that was, for one time we talked outside in a restaurant. Normally I would talk to them in the camp where they were with their parents, with parents there. Not the best of situations, but that's how it usually went. Now, if we go back on the slides, we forgot about them. Yes, yeah. Okay, now the first slide. This is one that we all know. This is ISIS on the way to Mosul, where they declared the Caliphate in 2014. And here is another one of the paintings made by, he calls himself Painter Ammar, the Yazidi painter who did the cover of my Dutch book. And this is, of course, how the women were kidnapped. ISIS took them in trucks and killed the men, most of the men, in the same place. The ISIS men were told about the Yazidi women who were coming, and there is a little movie on internet where they are talking about how they are looking forward to this happening, how they are looking forward to the girls they will have, and it is one of the most disgusting things that you can see. Now the next one is a map that shows you where ISIS was. And this gives you an idea of how people were told, how women were told how to dress. They went actually, it became stricter and stricter. In the beginning, it was just a simple niqab. Niqab is just with one bit of fabric in front of your nose. By the end, there were 3 bits of fabric, and after that, they also had to cover their eyes. Yeah. So it became a burqa. Because the burqa is what they wear in Afghanistan, which is the sack, more or less. Now, I was already telling you about the women that were sometimes more radical even than the men. Among the foreign women, there was a group that was really, really active and really radical, and they also had training with guns. And although at the beginning there was a fatwa, they were not allowed to fight with the men. The women were to look after the families and the husbands and to raise the children. The children were very important. But towards the end, the last battle of ISIS in Baghouz, beginning of this year, there were women, like the women that you see on this slide, that were also fighting with the men. So by that time, things had changed, and they really needed the women to be also active in the fight. Those women were also very active on the internet with propaganda, and they would put their kids with all kinds of ISIS flags and Allies big on caps, and with guns, of course.
And we saw the other two.
Yeah.
I just wanted to comment that Kayla Mueller is her last name, right? What's her last name? Got a lot of media attention, whereas all of these women, if it weren't for your book, nobody would have read their stories. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Should we take questions from the audience? I'm pretty
we
sure.
still have your question.
Oh, we do have my question.
Yeah.
Okay, yes.
You wanted me to talk about the situation.
Well, I do. I don't know if everyone else does, but I do want to pick your brain about that one.
Yeah.
Yes? Okay.
Okay. Well, the situation in Iraq, it is at the moment, there's 2 things really that are important. Let's stay with ISIS for a moment, because here in the West, everybody seems to think that ISIS is gone. Well, it's not. Actually, it is sort of regrouping. At the last phase of the battle in Syria, ISIS people were captured by the Kurds in Syria, and 70,000 people, men, women, and children, were put in camps and prisons. Apart from those, there were still a lot of people on the run. They had been since Mosul fell and all the other cities in Iraq fell. And at the moment, we know that at least 30,000 ISIS members are roaming around in Iraq and Syria. And they are active. Every day, you don't hear it, I do, but you don't. Every day there is an attack somewhere. It can be small, it can be big. The last one was yesterday in Baghdad. And Baghdad has been quiet for a long time in this sense. Yesterday in Baghdad there were 3 simultaneous car bombings. And ISIS said they did it, and as they were simultaneous, I guess that was true. So that is still a problem, and the problem is also that before ISIS leader Baghdadi was killed, he called for all those people in the prison to escape and to restart the quest for a new caliphate. So it's not gone, it's a pause. And the problem is, next to that the situation in Syria and Iraq is not stable at all. Let's stay with Iraq for a moment. Iraq, since the beginning of October, is having as what we call the tuk-tuk revolution. It's a revolution of young people that now, this time, will not stand down. They have had this, I think, just about every year since 2011. They're protesting against their corrupt government, against the fact that there is no services, against the fact that there is a small group that has all the money, while the biggest group doesn't have it. They don't have chances for jobs, they don't have chances for a future. This time, they are really there to stay until something is changing. I really think that this is what they're going to do, because now violence has started. And yesterday, it was a very bad day. If I remember well, 23 dead in one of the places in the south, because it's the whole of south of Iraq, the Shiite south of Iraq, that is now where people are protesting. Why are they protesting? The Shiites are in power in Iraq. They are the biggest group. But normally, when you are in power, you look after your people. Shiites have not done that. They have put all this oil money and all the money that has come in from countries helping with the rebuilding, like America, Holland, Europe. They're putting part of it in their pocket. And because of that, even though it is an oil-rich country, there is poverty in an enormous extent. The fight of ISIS sort of helped, because a lot of these poor people went to fight ISIS, and they had at least a meal, often a salary. So that helped. But now the fight against ISIS is over, and everybody is back to square one, and that is, what's the future for this young generation? 60% of the Iraqis is under 25. Just let that. And a lot of these people see no future. They have been studying, but then they don't find a job. Even there is no private enterprise. The jobs are with the government, and then when you sit in a government job, there is no work, because, for all these people, there is no work. So on the one hand, you have a state that is very costly because of all these people that work there, that is very corruptive, because you can buy just about anything. Let me give my own example. I'm not proud of it, but it was sort of a sport. To be able to stay in Iraq, you need a residency. And for that residency, you have to do a blood test. And I have refused that from day one. I was like, it's not your right to know anything about my medical record. I'm not doing a blood test for you. And I have been able to arrange that, like you can arrange just about everything in Iraq. That's why the country is so corrupt, because it goes from very low to very high. And that's also why this revolution has to go on, because something has to change dramatically.
Do you think it will? Are you optimistic?
I think it's going to take a bit longer, and I'm afraid that there's already 400 plus dead and 20,000 plus wounded. I think that might double. I think it will go on after the end of the year, probably, because there is so much at stake. What happened? Let me try to keep this simple, because I know I'm giving you a lot of information. Let me try to keep this simple. After 2003, when the Saddam regime was evicted, a new system was put in place. That system was based on religion and ethnicity, meaning that from then on, the parties were religious, Shiite or Sunni, and they were Kurdish. So those parties are in power now. And that system is making it very possible for people to put your family member into a job, so nepotism, to find someone that will help you to get something done. It's very much part of the system. And the people in the top have been able to use the system to enrich themselves. a lot of the money that is going around in the country is actually taken out and put into foreign bank accounts. We know of the former prime minister that he has millions, billions even, in bank accounts outside. We know of the Kurdish leaders that they have these kind of bank accounts. Nobody's doing anything about it. Now the problem is, if you don't use that money in your own country, it's getting poorer, and your economy is not going anywhere. So one of the good things about Kurdistan, if you compare it to the rest of Iraq, and I lived in Kurdistan mainly, is that at least there people have 2-3 houses. They have 4 or 5 cars. Don't need it, but at least that money is spent on their own economy, which means that in general the Kurdistan region is better off than the rest of Iraq.
There seems to be a lot of development there as well.
Yes, and that's also because the rest of Iraq really only changed after 2003. The Kurds started there, and then it was semi-autonomous region in 1992, after the Gulf War, after the Kuwait War, I should say. They stood up against Saddam, and they were helped. They were helped by the international community with a no-fly zone. Sorry, I had to look for the word. A no-fly zone that made sure that Saddam could at least not bomb them. So they were able from 92 to rule over their own area, and you can still see that they are more forward than the rest of Iraq. They have been able to develop more. They have been able to build more, and the money stayed in their own region.
And women seem to be a bit more independent, if we can say that, than in the rest of Iraq, I think. I mean, they work more. They are always controlled in a way by their family, but they seem to be somewhat more independent than the average Iraqi woman. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, I'm always very careful here. Well, actually, at the moment, it is the days against violence against women. Now, this is one thing about Kurdistan. For most of the years that I've lived there, they have had, around this date, a ceremony with the prime minister for this what do you call it, task. So the government has, at least by mouth, always been saying that violence against women is not accepted. They put in a law to make it punishable, but if you look in general, many women in Kurdistan will not take a taxi. That is because taxi drivers have been known to harass women, even rape them, and they have known not to get any help from the police if that happened. And in that way, just if people know that you take a taxi, it's bad for your status, because your honor might just not be so bright. Yeah. Women in Kurdistan are in higher positions, but even so, in the governments, you hardly see them. The parliament has 30% need to be women. The Iraqi parliament has 25% that need to be women. But that doesn't mean that women really have a say.
That's the quota. That's the quota that they have.
Yeah. Okay. Because a lot of these women, they are just there to vote. They are just there. They have been put there by the parties because they get a nice salary, but they don't really cover the women issues. And this is a big frustration for the women organizations. Yeah. I don't see that change very soon, because one of the problems with the poverty is also that religion is still strong, conservatism is still strong, and if you don't move the masses forward, then I don't think very much is going to change for the women.
Are women in Iraqi Kurdistan getting more of an education than in other places, do you think?
Well, in
Do
general,
they have more access to
general, they
education?
do have access to education. There's a lot of universities. In the Kurdistan region, I think it's about 30 at least, which is far too many. And everybody wants to go to the university. Of course, you can't give all these people a job. Also in the rest of Iraq, there's many, many universities, and a lot of kids are able to go there. But then, so the system as such is not helping to give young people a future, a job, an income.
Before we take questions from the audience, can I ask you if you're writing another book? Would you like to tell us?
Yes. I am at the moment writing about my 10 years in Iraq, and actually my book starts in 2003, not in 2008 when I moved to Iraq, because 2003 is where the circles of violence that I'm writing about, when one of them really started. So if you look at the cycle of violence, one started when Saddam was toppled. And then afterwards, because my main question is, in my book, how come that this violence does not go away in Iraq? It repeats itself, it repeats itself, it repeats itself. When one conflict is finished, you can already see that the next one is going to come. And what I do in this new book is I look at what are those cycles and why are they there? And it is really, I mean, when you do not end a conflict in a good way, when you do not help people to deal with the results of that conflict, when you don't try to bring people that have fought each other nearer to each other, as one of the examples, all those families of ISIS fighters that are still in camps in Iraq and Syria, if you don't give them a normal life again and you don't bring people together, you make them live together with other people again, you know that the next conflict is already there. So I'm afraid that book is not going to be a very very positive one. But it needs to be said, it needs to be written, because I think we need to learn from that. We need to do more when conflicts end. We don't, like now, we're saying, okay, ISIS is gone. It's beaten. Baghdadi is dead. It's gone. It's not. And we are still responsible. And I'm sure one of the questions you would like to ask, and I'm going to answer now, one of the problems that we also have to solve is those people that came from Europe and went to fight with ISIS or went to marry a fighter and get the children. In Holland, and I also see America and England do it, those are the main stories that we get at the moment, the stories of the perpetrators. And this is what everybody is getting themselves hot about. This is not the main problem. We have to solve it, yes. And as far as I'm concerned, we have to solve it by taking those people back. And I guess we will, because now Assad has said that he's going to try them. And then I'm sure nobody wants that. So probably that might be the way that finally the countries are going to take them back. If we don't take those people back, and especially if we don't take the children back, the radicalization will go on and the problem will only get bigger. We need to take them out of there. We need to take them out of the possibility of ISIS regrouping. And then, of course, we have to do something about this enormous problem in Iraq and Syria that we are neglecting, that we're sort of closing our eyes for. The problem of frustration, of families stuck in camps, of fighters stuck in prisons, nothing happening to them. And in those prisons, the radicalization is going on. In the camps, the radicalization of the women and the children is going on. So we cannot let this fester. We have to do something.
on that happy note. Questions from the audience? Anyone? Should we? Oh, okay, a microphone is on its way.
Hi. Your presentation was really interesting. I wanted to know how you protected yourself when you went out there to interview the women, and weren't you afraid ISIS might show up?
Well, there's one thing that you shouldn't be when you work in Iraq, and that's scared. So, no, I don't protect myself. I see some of my colleagues from the big news agencies go with guards and cars that are, what do you call them?
Armored.
Yeah, armored, yeah.
I mean, did you have to dress a traditional way so you could blend
Sometimes,
in? Or,
not with the Yazidis, of course, because Yazidis are very open-minded. They are not Muslim. They are very open-minded. They drink. So not for the Yazidis. But when I go to Iraq, to some of the areas that have been liberated from ISIS, some of the Sunni areas that are conservative themselves, yes, then I choose to wear loose pants, loose shirts. I will wear a scarf, and I don't stay too long because many of those areas are not completely safe. So if you don't stay too long, then at least the story doesn't go around that there is a stranger in town.
when you say too long, do you mean a few hours or a few days?
I usually stay hours. I come and go. Mm-hmm. That's the best in that situation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Okay.
The population of Kurdistan, with 30 universities, what is the population?
Five and a half million.
Yeah, that's a very, very big number. Can they influence other areas of Iraq?
That's a good question because they have tried. Because they were forward all these years between 92 and 2003, they had already built their own institutions. They were already working on gender. While in Baghdad at the moment still the gender issue is hardly on the table. So the Kurds do try, but they have also given up sort of because they are up against religion, they're up against people who don't really want that kind of change. And there is something much more important. The change of politics is much more needed than what most people perceive as less important, gender issues, environment issues. In Kurdistan, when I came there for the first time in 2003, environment was hardly an issue, and yet they were driving cars without filters. They were throwing plastic bottles everywhere. It was an issue, but people didn't see it as an issue. Now, because they have developed, it's starting to become an issue. Finally, they're starting to build plants to burn to recycle the waste. Up till now, everything is burned. In my house in Erbil, when the wind was from the wrong side, I would have to close my windows because it was terrible, a terrible smell from the smoke of the garbage. The plastic thing still is not really addressed. A major issue is also that because of the lack of electricity that the state gives, there are a lot of generators, and generators are dirty. They pollute the air terribly, and if you have a lot of them, in Erbil, for instance, in the summer, there really is smog in sometimes. And I lived near to the airport, which was a little bit in a sort of scoop.
Mm-hmm. I remember that area.
Yeah, and often the planes cannot leave because that pollution is hanging there. So, do the Kurds try to influence? They may try, but there is other issues that are more important, really. There was another question.
The gentleman in the back.
Gentleman at the back, yeah.
Sorry.
Hi. Firstly, thank you for being here and educating us. I have two questions, if that's okay. The first one is based on curiosity mostly. You said in the beginning of the talk that children that were captivated, they became fighters, right? I assume that's boys. And you said that girls, after 9 years of age, they're okay for marriage. So what happened to the girls who were captivated or not captivated that were not 9 years old? What happened to those girls?
Thanks for the question, because that's an issue that I didn't address, and it's an important one. The younger children were given to ISIS families to be brought up in Islam. And I met a couple of those kids. For instance, a young girl, how old was she? 13. She could not speak her own language anymore. She was speaking Turkish because she had been with Turkish ISIS fighters. She had been taught the Islam. She knew the Quran by heart, almost. And when she came back into the Yazidi community, because these kids do come back into the community, they have a hard time. I met another young boy, a very interesting case. He spoke English because his ISIS mother was an American woman called Sam. She's at the moment she's back in America, standing trial for some of the things that she did. But she looked after him very well. He became big friends with her son, and she made sure that he remembered the name of his mother and that he was Yazidi. So when they were caught, I think that was when Mosul was captured, she actually said, and he also said to the Iraqi army, that the boy was Yazidi. Now, he, Ayman, I think he was called, he went back to his family. His mother was still missing. There was only his father. And some uncles and cousins. But he didn't feel at home at all. He wanted to go on speaking English. And he wanted me to take him back to America, please. So these children are brought in a very difficult position. They are brainwashed, and when they return, sometimes they have even forgotten that they were Yazidi, and they come back to people that they don't know anymore. They come back in a society where many people are traumatized. It's an enormous problem.
I see. Thank you. If it's okay with everybody to ask the second question, if not, thank you. Look, as a non-religious person, I'm really fascinated by religion and how it affects societies, right? And it's pretty apparent that, extremist groups throughout history and currently are based on fundamentalism. I mean, religious fundamentalism, right? So this whole thing you're talking about and what we know about ISIS, you said they cherry-picked from the Quran the parts they wanted to keep, the aggressive ones. But, do you see any, I guess my question is, do you see any light in the end of the tunnel in these kind of societies when they're very religious or strictly religious and they don't allow room for any openness in that sense? I mean, to me, it seems like a, first kind of level barrier that you have to break to start having a society that gets more developed, because that keeps it limited. Would you agree with something like that, or? Well,
I think ISIS is really, it's a niche. It is a very small group, and in Iraq, among Sunnis, they are not popular at all, of course. It also, the effect it had on the Sunnis was that many of the young people, the young Sunni people, decided that this definitely was not what they wanted. So they were, what I saw in Mosul, the couple of times that I was there, was that young people were very much active trying to get more freedom. In Mosul, for instance, they started book cafes that were mixed. In the Mosul society before, mixing of boys and girls was not allowed. There was talk of, I met some artists and they told me that the part of the universities also had been split to male and female. And part of that was also, that was done with the Arts Academy. And there was already talk of bringing together the boys and the girls into the academy. So something has started moving there. And that is because they have realized so well that that is the path they don't want to go. So I think the young people, as they are the majority also in that part of Iraq, they will make the change. The problem is, though, that the next conflict is already there. So will they be able to make that change while that conflict is going on?
Thank you. That's,
okay.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Did you want to ask something?
Yeah, I had two questions, but yeah, I'll think. One of them is, can you tell us more about the ISIS women who came from Europe and who were not from Islam? Like maybe they were, let's say, a white Dutch woman, for example, who converted to Islam. Did you say that these were the most radical ones? And do you think these people were kind of, let's say, psychopaths who were thinking, oh wow, that's an opportunity, like, I'd like to kill some people, so let's join ISIS. I mean, what's your theory about it? Were they actually spiritually religious people, or they just thought it's going to be a wild party for them because they're crazy?
Well, let's start with that last part, because one of the big problems was that ISIS was attracting a lot of criminals, and that is because the recruiting happened in prisons. And ISIS promised that if you would convert to Islam, your past would be forgiven. So some of those drug addicts and drug sellers and criminals found that a way out. And they are one of the reasons why ISIS became so incredibly violent. Now, talking about the women that came from Europe, why would Dutch or English or American women want to go? Actually, there is another very interesting book that has been written about this. That's called the Guest House for the Widows. The main reason for them is not religion. The main reason for most of the women who joined ISIS was that they were looking for another life. They were often looking for a man, but not only. They were often frustrated with their lives, and that frustration is one of the things that are returning whenever you look at ISIS, because for the men that was also a very important reason for joining. Frustration about the fact that you could not get the life that you wanted. And I'm making this very broad because it is that broad. For women, some of the women were really looking for the knight on the white horse. But some of them had already converted to Islam before, and they were looking for freedom to live the religion as they thought they had to live it. They had already been, after their conversion, they had been caught up in radical quarters, with radical imams, in radical mosques, and they were being harassed in the society because the society was trying to prevent radicalization happening. For them, this was just harassment, and some of them, for that reason, went to Syria because that's where most of them went. One of the reasons why a lot of people felt attracted to going to Syria was actually the battle that was going on in Syria. ISIS was using that for the propaganda very, very much. Look, these are Muslims. We have to go and help them. they need to have their own Islamic state. Come and help. And that was, for a lot of people who joined ISIS, that was one of the important reasons to go. Did I cover your question?
Yes, I mean you did, but at the same time, because for example, if let's say I wanted to to go and join ISIS because I want a utopian society where people don't drink and it's the love of God, a religious country, how would I quickly start getting people raped, having children, like beating them up? But I mean, how can someone who is, because you can be very conservative and very spiritual and have very strict ideas about male and female roles, but to start getting children to sleep with your husband, or to have a brothel for the leader of, I mean, what kind of person would think that this is part of a religion? You know what I mean? Because I mean, I grew up in Syria and I met a lot of Muslims, and most of them were religious, but they never thought, I mean, they wouldn't think that this is part of their religion. You know what I mean?
But I guess the answer to your question is really indoctrination.
But how can you be so... I mean, what I wanted to say is, are some of them mentally damaged, or there's something wrong? Because, I mean, how can someone indoctrinate you to think such a thing unless you already have that wish?
I should add that many of the women who went found not what they wanted.
Oh, were shocked.
They were shocked, yes,
okay.
a lot of them. But, of course, there is also the ones that didn't do anything with that shock, but turned it around, tried to convince themselves that this was what they wanted and what they believed in.
Right.
But very important in all this is the indoctrination. Everybody who came into the Caliphate from outside was put into trainings, men and women. And these trainings were in such a way, I have read some of the material that was used, that it went back to what the Quran was saying, and as I said, they only picked those parts that they could use. So it made, and you should realize, most of the people do not know Arabic.
Mm-hmm.
So what you get is a sort of Quran that's not the real one. That is the Quran that is usable for indoctrination.
Yeah.
Of course, inside ISIS there are also people who are genuinely religious and who really believe all this. They are there.
Mm.
I cannot believe this myself either. And for me, I always try to put them in a pocket, because this is something I cannot deal with. I have the same question as you.
Yeah.
How can you, from a faith that is supposed to be peaceful, come up with all this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, for example, you can have a religious... I mean, Baghdadi, if you see him, he looks like a criminal. He doesn't look like a religious person. He looks like a brute, like a gangster.
Now,
so that, because there are religious imams who are very, very conservatives, but they look kind of holy, or they have some wisdom. They have something. You might not agree with them. Like a Greek Orthodox. You might not agree with them, but you can still see that they're holy or devout. But people like Baghdadi doesn't look. He just looks like a murderer. That's what he looks.
Let me tell you something about imams in Iraq. When students go to study, they need to collect points. So in the last exams before you go to a university, you collect the points to determine which study you're going to follow. If you want to do medicine, you have to be 96 out of 100, I think. Very much. Then the lawyers, then etc., etc. The lowest points you need to go to an Islamic institution to study. So they are not the brightest people.
Because they come across as like not bright and crazy.
And of course I'm generalizing here, because there are very clever imams as well. And I think it's also important to mention that part of ISIS is the heritage of Saddam. His secret service people, his militias, his part of his army, because when after 2003 the Iraqi army was dissolved, a lot of people who were trained military were out of a job. Many of them went with ISIS eventually.
Okay. Yeah,
So there is also there is religion, but not only.
Yeah.
It was also about power, very much so. It was about power, money, and sex, as I write in my book.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Anyone else? No? Well, there doesn't appear to be another one. Oh, yes, of course. Yes.
Wait.
No, it's okay. I mean, how about the responsibility of the West for all this situation? And let's concentrate on your women, and let's leave the politics behind if we can. But do we have a responsibility as West?
For me, yes. For me, yes, we do have a responsibility. It was, I think what happened, we didn't see it in the beginning. But when we saw what was happening, there was not enough that was being done. I already mentioned harassing people doesn't help to keep them satisfied and inside your country. I think we're not doing enough. There should be more de-radicalization programs. There should be more thinking, more developing on what can you do to make sure that people do not go to these kinds of organizations. I think we should look at what happens inside a sect and what happens to people who come out of a sect, because you can really compare that. Before I started on ISIS, I wrote a book about a sect, an Iranian sect, the Mujahideen Khalq. And I talked to people who came out of that sect, who actually now are involved in de-radicalizing members of ISIS. There is a very good comparison between the two. And I think we should really focus on what can we do. And it's not going to be 100%. It never will be, because there's people who do not want to change. But we should work on it. We should develop. And at the moment, we're just sitting there and thinking, oh, these people that are coming back, we don't want them. We are going to have to want them, because we can't leave them there. It's going to happen. And instead of taking your time and saying, no, we don't want it, we should think about what can we do about them. What can we do to make sure that they're not going to be a problem in our society? That discussion should really start. Yeah?
Well, reading all of the stories is a good start as well for us to understand them better, since so many of them are here, and we're hoping to, if they get to stay, that we will integrate them into our societies, or if they go in other places in Europe, that will happen for them as well. But a good prerequisite, I think, is getting to know who they are, hearing their stories, and you've contributed greatly to that. So thank you. And thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thank you very much.
Judith.
Judit Neurink, Niki Boehm, on behalf of all of us at Lexikopoleio, thank you so much. We will share a glass of wine if you stay along. And of course, Judit Neurink will sign Slaves, Wives and Brides for you. They're all here, as well as the Jewish Bride. It's available here at Lexikopoleio. Thank you so much. A great big applause for the two ladies. Thank you.